rainy night. I'm standing just to prove that I can stand, for those of you who've been here before. I sat through everything else. Seriously, I want to start with an apology, actually. When we were putting the classes together for this semester, I totally missed the fact that tonight is Rosh Hashanah. And that means that there are people who would want to be here for class tonight who can't. And that's my fault, because I just missed it in the schedule. But I want to start with that because we are, in fact, sensitive to the world around us, and we want as many people as possible to be able to attend these sessions. So if we find ourselves in that circumstance moving forward, we will make adjustments around that. And if you do have friends or colleagues who might have been here tonight but who are not here because it is a very important religious moment, please express to them, and I'll do it again next week, but we try to accommodate. The other thing that I'll say about this subject, and we were just talking, I think you all know we have a group of students here who are enrolled in a variety of programs within the university, sociology and planning, and one started tonight who's in engineering, who want to know about this subject matter. And so we and they have a conversation for about an hour before this class starts. And we follow a large lecture class that deals with health and sociological issues. And that prior class lingered for a while because they had a very interesting conversation about what our stereotypes are about being someone who is addicted to drugs. When I was growing up in Harlem, someone who was addicted to drugs was a junkie. It was someone who you stayed away from. They weren't necessarily dangerous to you unless you thought that they were going to mug you or something, but most of the time they didn't have enough energy to do that. And the stereotype was of a person who was an outcast and not a part of respectable society. That stereotype has morphed. And the class prior to ours talked about how that stereotype has changed and how it is that there's significantly more sensitivity to the needs of people who have opioid addictions, and why it's important for us as a caring community to provide support and services to those individuals. There are more people dying of drug overdoses now than are dying of automobile accidents. And so the way we think about opioid addiction is changing from the way I, as a kid in Harlem, used to think about junkies. And I would have to say that's a good thing. Well, in our class, we started to talk about homelessness and what the stereotype is of a homeless person, and whether we think of that homeless person as someone who is a part of the matrix of the society that we need to care for. Why should we do this? And you're going to answer this in part. But the underlying question really is, what are our values? What's important? Some cities particularly those that pride themselves on having, being attractive as tourist destinations, do everything they can to see to it that homeless people are concealed, swept aside, hidden. And some cities, and I say this from direct experience, some cities have gone so far, as happened here in Massachusetts when I worked in one of the city administrations. Some cities have gone so far wherein they look at the services that are available in their city, and they look at the services that are available in other cities. And I know in Massachusetts that what used to happen was that social workers in cities outside of Boston would buy homeless people one-way tickets to Boston and say, when you get off of the bus at the bus station, someone will be there to help you. And we've been fortunate in Boston. I rode around with Ray Flynn in his station wagon when he would pick up homeless people off the streets at night and take them to shelters. And Mayor Menino, while he didn't do that, clearly cared about homelessness in Boston in all of its permutations. And Mayor Walsh has clearly indicated that he cares too. And if we saw that kind of commitment in some of the other American cities I've visited recently, like San Francisco and LA, then maybe we would feel that in fact there is a national commitment to addressing the needs of people who don't have homes. Because whatever stereotype we have, the stereotype we have is wrong. And however we think that it's okay to shunt individuals aside because they don't have a home, not because they have a problem, because they don't have a home, which is what happens in a great many American cities, then we have to hold a mirror up to ourselves to ask ourselves, not only how far removed are we from being that person, but how do we show that we really care in a society that is probably the wealthiest in the history of humankind? So I ask somewhat rhetorically a question as we start, which is, what is your stereotype of what it means to be homeless? And secondly, what is our responsibility to work with and to share what we have with those who don't have a roof over their heads? So that's the academic question, and who's starting? You're on.
Okay. If I could find it. So I'm going to start out by, so we're, the topic today.
Turn the mic on.
Oh, it's...
How's that? Can you hear me now? Okay. So the topic that I was asked to speak, my name is Louie Hayes. I'm the executive director of an agency called Homes for Families, and we're a grassroots membership organization of family shelter providers and work on the issue of family homelessness across the state. So I was asked to come today to talk about chronic homelessness. So the first thing I'm going to do is tell you I'm not going to talk about the topic. I'm going to talk about family homelessness, which a lot of public policy is about semantics and definitions. So we'll cover understanding the family homelessness system and creating systems change. And so you brought up stereotypes. So I think when we think about the stereotypical homeless person, the image behind those words might come to mind a little bit. And the definition of chronic homelessness is someone who's an individual with a disabling condition and someone that's been homeless for either longer than a year or at least 4 episodes in the past 3 years, or someone living in an area not meant for human habitation or in an emergency shelter. But when we talk about family homelessness, there's lots of different definitions that we use. We use that homeless definition, which means living in an emergency shelter in a place not meant for human habitation, or the way that schools count it with this long, complicated definition is also includes children that may be doubled up, children that are living on couches, couch surfing, living in campgrounds, and other alternative places because their parents can't afford a place to call home. So this is who we're talking about when we talk about homelessness. So it might be a little bit different from the image that you had in your head during the opening of thinking about the stereotypical homeless person. All of these pictures are taken of children in the United States of America. A lot of them are not Massachusetts. You can see the child on the street with the sign. There's someone. Oh, there it is. That girl there. These 2 guys in the corner. Those are in LA and New York. So this is also in our country that we have children that are living out on the streets without a place to go home. You don't see this as much in Boston. We're not immune to it in Boston. We do have children that live on the streets, in cars. Usually it's temporary, and that's a lot of it because of the policy decisions that we've made as a state and as a city. So the scope of the crisis in Massachusetts is last year statewide. I'm going to give you a lot of numbers. I'm going to go quick so we have time for questions at the end. I just really want you to think about those numbers of if they're big, if they're small, if they're in line, what you would think would be acceptable in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Last year, 7,950 families applied for state shelter, and 4,860 entered the system. So the rest were determined not to be eligible. So that's individual families, so times that by about 3 to get the number of men, women, and children. 39% of those families, or 1,511, that entered the shelter system entered in the city of Boston. And the average caseload, daily caseload across the state is about 3,545. Last year, Massachusetts teachers across the state identified 21,122 students that were homeless in ages K through 12. Boston Public Schools had numbers about 4,000. So July 31st, at the beginning of this fiscal year, there was 2,074 children in emergency shelters in Boston alone. 143 were under the age of 1, 811 were age 1 through 5, 798 elementary school age, and 312 high school age. So we talk about chronic homelessness. Generally, when it's how it's defined by the federal government, we're talking about individuals, but we have chronic homelessness on the family side too. 66% are short-term temporary stayers, but about 19% of families in the system are repeat stayers. And there's also a rule that if a family leaves a shelter, they can't come back in for 12 months, so this is a little bit skewed. So 19% are repeat stayers, 13% stay longer than 700 days, and 2% fall into both those categories. So chronic homelessness is not something that's just on the individual side. We see a lot of that in families too. When we're talking about family homelessness, it's largely an economic issue. When we look at the city of Boston, the Smart Asset Tech Company estimated that family household needs to earn $120,000 a year to be able to afford rent in the city of Boston. Other estimates are a little lower, in the 70s, high 60s and 70s. The Boston Planning and Development Agency did a study that showed that half of Boston residents earn less than $35,000 a year. So a lot of the people that are making this city run they had 2 jobs, 3 jobs, still can't afford the cost of rent. So you can see that over time, the bottom purple row is TFDC benefits, that's welfare benefits. Blue is the minimum wage. That rent has increased at a pace that's a lot faster than wages. So at a time in the early 80s, before there was a shelter system and homelessness crisis, you could be poor and afford a place to live. As time's gone on, you can't be poor and afford a place to live anymore. So this is looking at about 33% is what the estimated amount that households should be paying of their income towards rent. So you see how wide that gap is. And that's in part because we simply just don't have enough housing. The National Low Income Housing Coalition estimates that Massachusetts is short 158,000 units available to extremely low income households. 158,000 units across the state, just for the lowest of income households. So I also wanted to show this for a couple reasons. It's one, that gap that's needed for households to be able to afford rent, but also when you look at housing subsidies and the cost for government programs to assist, how much more expensive they become. So a housing subsidy may have make that $200 difference at one point, now it's $300, $400, $900 to make that difference between wages and rent. So when you look at those shelter numbers, the 3,554 families in shelters right now, it's really only the tip of the iceberg. This is City of Boston data that 81,945 low-income households spend more than 30% of their income on rent and mortgage. And approximately 51,700 of those are paying more than 50%. So there's our pipeline of families that are going to become homeless. When we talk about family homelessness, we talk about trauma. About 90% of the families in shelters, a lot of studies have shown that up to 90% have had physical or sexual abuse. Look at displacement, the story that we talked about earlier, the number of individuals that come into Boston for services. We see the opposite happening with families. As rents go up, families from Boston are having to move to lower cost areas. We also see when families become homeless in Boston, there's not enough shelter space in Boston, so they're placed in shelter outside of their home community. So it's a lot of displacement out of Boston when it comes to families. And we look at racial and ethnic disparities. So the way that DHCD, that's the state's Department of Housing and Community Development, and the census collects information data on race. It's asked white, black, or Asian, and then you define yourself, are you Latino or non-Latino? When you break it down that way, it's 49% white, 40% black, and 44% Hispanic. We did a recent survey of families in Springfield and Boston, and just asked, how do you define your ethnicity or race? And that was broken down 27% white, 22% black, and 48% Hispanic. And we asked the question a little differently. And that was also in Springfield and Boston, which might have varied a little bit more if we went statewide. So just looking at those numbers compared to statewide, Massachusetts is 73% white, 8% black or African American, and Hispanic or Latino 11%. Just sit on that one for a minute. The reasons for homelessness are also not, I think, what some of the stereotypical reasons are. This is from the state's Department of Housing and Community Development. 57% come in as a direct result of health and safety. So this data is collected on why are you homeless today? Not how you got here, but where did you sleep last night? Why are you homeless today? 57% is health and safety, eviction is 12%, domestic violence is 13%. A landlord being doubled up, a landlord saying if you don't move out, will affect the primary tenant, is 12%. Fire and natural disaster, 1%. So you can see some of the way the communities come together during fires, during natural disasters, Red Cross. But oftentimes what we'll see is some of those instances, eviction, domestic violence, flood, fire, natural disaster, or threatened eviction, a family might then bounce around and stay with their friends and family and use their social support network before they apply to shelter, which is why we see so many on the health and safety side. Which if you further break that down, 63% of those are irregular housing. So that means families that are couch surfing and doubled up. 25%, remind you this is a program that serves children. 25% of the health and safety reasons are after staying in a place not meant for human habitation. And then some of the other ones are violent conduct, substance abuse and conditions in the unit of where families doubled up. So the system itself is the only statewide shelter system in the entire country. Other cities and states, it's a city run, it's a county run. Massachusetts is the only statewide system. And this is our one pop quiz. This is my only question that I ask. Well, it's a double one. Any guesses of what year the shelter system was established? 1970, it's 1983. So it's a relatively young system. And I have to ask this question this way because of where we are, but, and do you know who signed that law into being? Governor Dukakis, exactly. So you'll often see the newspaper called a right to shelter state. But as I showed earlier, about 50% of the families that apply for shelter are determined not to be eligible, which means they don't actually have a right to shelter. There's income qualifications, and you have to fit into certain categories and reason for homelessness. So what the state has is a legal mandate to place all eligible families. So what's happened over the years is the eligibility standards have changed. It's been 50% of the federal, it's been 90% of the federal poverty level, 130%, now it's 115. Reasons for homelessness, all sorts of things get changed in order to manage the flow of the families coming into the front door. There's 52 programs across the state, providing 3,400 units of shelter. 1,307, or 35% of those units are in Boston. It's by the state's Department of Housing and Community Development. We spent approximately $180 million last year on sheltering families. We spent about $90 million on the state's rental subsidy program. So where we're spending our money is on shelter, more so than on housing. And these numbers don't include domestic violence shelters, substance abuse shelters, community beds, church programs, and other privately funded programs, which isn't a lot, but probably an additional 500 to 700 families that might fall into some of those. So it's about 1% right now, families that are in motels. I think there was 46 this morning. 38% of the units are scattered sites, so those are like apartment buildings. 25% are co-shelters, that means 2 families in one apartment building, and 33% are congregates, which congregate is, a lot of them are former convents, former hospitals, former nursing homes, and a couple of big houses. So it's really dormitories with kids, which means it can be fun environments, can be tense environments, but it's an unnatural place to parent. And I think just put these pictures up of looking at the scattered site and co-shelters that takes housing stock off the market. So it's rooms that are being rented out by shelter providers with families in them. So that's one less apartment for a family or household to live in. There's a range of services. The green bar is in-house and then also referred out to other agencies or other agencies coming in, but it's a range: case management, housing search, workforce, child programming, domestic violence, workshops, trainings, all. So it's a very programmed system. And when you look at length of stay, I wanted to highlight this one and think back to the beginning of what it means for Boston, is the length of stay in shelter in Boston is the highest because it's the highest cost of living. So the length of stay for families that are in shelter in Boston is about 351 days. So this goes back to that displacement issue. If 39% of the families coming into shelter from Boston, 35% of the shelter stock, and the longest length of stay. So there's less movement out of the systems, which is why families are getting displaced from Boston into shelters across the state. So the city's role. The city, the Boston Housing Authority has a homelessness preference. This has been crucial and continues to be crucial in getting flow out of the system because a lot of the short-term and rental assistance just doesn't work. So Boston Housing has been big. They have a couple pilots now that focus on health with young children, and also one that they're launching now that works with children that are in Boston public schools in certain neighborhoods and really trying to have a child focus. The city of Boston is also responsible for helping pay for the transportation from shelters, and especially when families are placed in motels in Waltham or Malden. The school departments split the cost of transporting that child back to school in Boston so children can remain in their schools. The city also has an Office of Housing Stabilization that focuses on eviction prevention. They have some program funding, but it's been really, that comes from the feds, but it's been cut and cut and cut over the years, so it's very minimal. Some program support, some rapid rehousing money. And the lens of the city that the city's talked about is filling the gaps in the state safety net. So it really looks to the state as the primary safety net for families who are in shelter. And then one of their articulated goals is to fill the gap in that safety net. And they do that through a program that provides, if a family is homeless on the streets of Boston at night, they can call the mayor's hotline, which refers them to another program that puts them up for the night or potentially longer. That program, for the first time starting last year, now has a wait list, which we've never had before, but seeing more and more families that are not eligible and having no other answer. So systems change, to wrap up. So Homes for Families, what we focus on with systems change is making sure that we hear from families and shelter providers. The families who are experiencing homelessness are the experts in what they need, And so we really listen to families and shelter providers. We do a lot of convening, focus groups, and have families drive our advocacy agenda and work in the programs. We also work with a coalition called On Solid Ground that really focuses on bringing in the child care piece, the health care piece, the jobs and economic development, and focusing on data and research to really drive some of the systems change forward. I think we can't talk about addressing family homelessness without looking at the institutional and systemic racism, inequality, segregation, and discrimination, especially when we're looking in the city of Boston. For years, we've really looked at how does the system change to not be so that shelter is the only answer. So this is based on the 2007 Commission to End Homelessness. So we have a housing emergency, focus on assessing each individual family, prevent homelessness where we can, divert families instead of going to shelter. We rehouse families quickly and divert them from shelter using social networks, flexible cash assistance, outside services, or can we quickly rehouse someone, and for certain small percentage of families have shelter and support. Then once the family's in housing, really focus there while they're in housing to have opportunities, resources, and supports, and then to move up through workforce development and asset development until people are stable. This is my interpretation of where we are now. So I'll explain some of these pieces, that instead of looking at assessment, it's really based on eligibility criteria, which helps some families, but a lot of other families fall off that cliff, that are not eligible for any prevention services, not eligible for shelters. There's a lot of families that are left out. There are a lot of prevention programs when the money's there. It often dries up before the end of the year. Diversion has been a big piece where it's actually about 25%, or about 20% now of families that are eligible for shelter. They're able to divert and find other resources with flexible cash assistance using social support networks. A lot of reliance on short-term subsidies and rapidly rehousing families, but it's disconnected from right in front doors. Once families are in shelter, they can access some flexible cash assistance and one-year subsidies and shelters and motels. Stabilization is the hard part. It's more around tracking, some case management, some monitoring. Are you still in your unit or are you not? And needing to do ongoing housing search because most of the families are being rehoused with short-term subsidies. So instead of focusing on stabilization and keeping that housing, it's what are you going to do when this subsidy runs out, which then creates a whole other cliff. In workforce and asset development are there, but it's a little bit disjointed and needing some other connections, which leaves sort of that roof and people not as stable as they could be. But there's progress. This green is showing our average daily caseload from 2008 to present. So you see we're on a long decline, and the numbers are going down in the right direction. The blue represents shelter. So the way that they've gotten the numbers down is we've increased the number of shelter units, so families have more case management and support, and that's really brought the motel number down, and now the goal is to get the full caseload down. So the city really needs to look at our housing problem. We can't address homelessness if we don't have housing. When we look at 50% of the kids being under the age of 5, we need to address childcare and make sure that children are getting education. We need children focused in general. The system is serving kids, and how do we have more focus on the children? Education, jobs, careers, and wages. When you look at the wages in the city of Boston, when you look at the people that clean these office buildings at night, that are working in the cafeterias of the hospitals, of the colleges, the social workers, I run my Dunkin' Donuts, the fast food workers, we have the service industry, whole industries of people that can't afford to live here. And as a society, we need to make that choice of who, if we want to depend on people to make the city run, they need to be able to live here. Urging the city to be reactive, instead of being reactive, to being proactive. Instead of being the gap below the safety net, how do we get above it so that shelter is the absolute last resort? The shelter is not the goal to get there, but how do we keep everyone out of shelter and stable in their neighborhoods? And shared responsibility. It's not up to the Department of Housing and Community Development to solve this alone. It's something that everyone has to take a piece of. We also need an anti-racist and equity lens. Redlining was a big piece of how we created this crisis. That was an intentional disinvestment in certain areas. Excuse me. So how do we then intentionally reinvest in those areas with jobs and housing? We need to be more prevention focused and focus more on assessment instead of eligibility. and building out that stabilization piece. So that's my part. Sorry to throw a lot of it. That was 2 years, an hour of information into a short amount of time, but I'll hand it over to Tom.
The mic, that's good because you can't see the face.
All right. This will take a second to get used to, I think. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tom Byrne. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Social Work at Boston University. So hockey rivals from Northeastern, but grateful that you guys had me here tonight, and thank all of you guys for coming as well. Whereas Libby was focusing mainly on families who are experiencing homelessness, I'm going to be talking more specifically about the population of folks who are homeless as single adults. This is a group of folks who are characteristically quite different from the population of folks who are experiencing homelessness as part of a family. So I just want to make that clear from the outset. And really, what I want to do is, for you guys, is emphasize 3 points that I think are important to keep in mind when we're talking about chronic homelessness that I'd like to emphasize. The first is sort of a good news story, which is chronic homelessness, and we're talking specifically about single adults here. Chronic homelessness is a problem that we can solve. And not only can we solve it, but solving it makes for good public policy for a number of reasons. But it's important to remember that we need to understand addressing chronic homelessness and ending chronic homelessness just as a beginning and not an end. It's just the start of the work, I think, of addressing homelessness. So before getting into those 3 points, I just want to give you a little bit of background on what it is exactly we mean by chronic homelessness. So as its name suggests, chronic homelessness refers to folks who are experiencing homelessness on an extended basis. And a lot of what we know about chronic homelessness comes out of some research that was done going back almost 20 years now using emergency shelter data from the city of New York and from Philadelphia. And there was some analysis of those data that essentially stratified the population of folks who use emergency shelter into 3 distinct groups. And you can see the majority of folks, the red bars in this graph represent the percentage of folks who are users of emergency shelter, and the blue bars are the percentage of shelter days that they use. So you can see on the one end of that graph, you have about 81% of folks who are what's typically referred to as transitionally homeless. They're in shelter for a fairly limited period of time and generally don't come back. You have a group of folks, they're about 80% of all folks who use shelter. They use about 35% of all shelter days. You have a group in the middle that's episodically homeless. They're coming in and out of shelter over time on multiple occasions, about 9% of the population. And then you have a group on the far right here who are chronically homeless. They're about 10% of all folks who use shelter, but they account for about half of all shelter days used. And these are folks who enter shelter and remain there for an extended basis. And this is a dynamic that shows up throughout the country when we're looking at homeless single adults. With the help of Lila and some of her colleagues at the Department of Neighborhood Development, I was able to do a similar analysis of data from the emergency shelter system here in Boston. And what you see is a fairly similar dynamic. You have about 2/3, 70% of folks who are short-term, one-time users of emergency shelter, and at the end of the spectrum, you have a group of folks who are chronically homeless and use a lot of the resources in the system. So that's kind of in concept what we mean by chronic homelessness. The federal government has created an official definition of what the criteria is for chronic homelessness. I won't read through it for you, but it's essentially someone who's experiencing a continuous episode of homelessness for an extended duration or is repeatedly homeless over time, just kind of in keeping with that three-group typology. Another thing to know about chronic homelessness is that it can be very expensive to society. Folks who are chronically homeless typically are using not only shelter resources, which can be fairly expensive, but lots of other public services, healthcare, criminal justice system. So there's been a whole number of studies that have been done kind of looking at the costs of chronic homelessness, and estimates kind of range depending on the city and the data sources that are included, but anywhere from $20,000 a year to over $100,000 a year, just in terms of the costs of maintaining someone, keeping someone in the state of homelessness as they cycle through shelter and all these other systems as well. One other thing to know about the single adult homeless population is that there's a really unique cohort effect that is at play here. This is a population that is getting older. What you see here is information on the age distribution of the single adult homeless population from the US Census in 1990, 2000, 2010, and then just projected for 2015. What you see is a shift rightwards in the age distribution of this population. So the peak of the age distribution now is around people who are in their mid-50s. So this is kind of a distinct trend from that of the general population, but this is a population that is getting older as well. So the bulk of the population is now in their late 40s to early 60s. All right, so on to the first point here. Chronic homelessness is a problem we can solve. And why is it a problem we can solve? It's a problem we can solve for two reasons. One, because we have, over the past 15 years or so, through some really creative folks who thought differently about how to provide housing to folks who are chronically homeless, and then through some rigorous research, we have a model that we know that works for addressing chronic homelessness. So what you see here is kind of what's known as the linear treatment or staircase model. And for a long time, this was the model that was used to try and assist folks who are chronically homeless. You would start by providing them with emergency shelter, and then provide them with transitional housing, which was contingent on them complying with mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment, being abstinent from using substances, and only after they had kind of gone through all those steps would they be provided with access to permanent housing. What's happened is that there's been the development of a new model known as permanent supportive housing that skips. This is often operated under the Housing First model. Folks may be familiar with the term Housing First, and as its name suggests, that approach puts access to permanent housing without preconditions first. So folks move immediately from the streets or from an emergency shelter into permanent housing, and rather than making housing contingent on treatment compliance, folks are provided with ongoing supportive services that they need to maintain stable housing once they're in permanent housing. And the evidence on the impact of this model is quite robust. There's been a number of rigorous randomized controlled trials that have demonstrated that it is highly effective for helping folks who are chronically homeless remain housed. This is just showing evidence from a study that was done in New York City. And this is showing the percentage of folks who were assigned to a Housing First, who were stably housed at 5 years, as compared to folks who were assigned to that linear staircase model that we saw earlier. So almost 90% of folks in Housing First were still housed at 5 years, relative to less than 50% of folks in that staircase model. And there's perhaps the best study that's been done of this was completed fairly recently in Canada. This was a multi-city study in which I think about 1,300 folks who were chronically homeless were assigned to either Housing First or treatment as usual. And again, a similar result. This is percentage of time stably housed. Folks who were assigned to the Housing First condition were stably housed almost 3/4 of the time, relative to about 30% of folks who didn't get Housing First. So, on the back of this evidence, there's been a lot of emphasis at the federal, state, and local level on expanding the availability of permanent supportive housing for folks who are chronically homeless. And what you see here is a graph showing the increase in the number of permanent supportive housing units nationwide, and we've seen that it's increased by about 70% since 2007, and that's coincided with, not coincidentally, about a 30% decline in the population of folks nationwide who are chronically homeless on any given night. So what does this look like in Massachusetts? We've seen a similar reduction in chronic homelessness over the past 10 years in Massachusetts. The most recent data that we have are from 2016. On a given night, just under 1,300 people in Massachusetts were experiencing chronic homelessness. And nationwide, we're talking about 80,000 folks on a given night who are chronically homeless. So we're not talking about a large number of people here. So just to kind of emphasize why this is a solvable problem, we have something that we know that is effective for addressing chronic homelessness, and we're not talking about a huge number of people. 1,300 people in Massachusetts, not that many. All right, so why is solving chronic homelessness good public policy? Well, I really appreciated that we started the conversation this evening talking about values, because I think that's a really important thing. Homelessness has a tremendous human cost. We're talking about folks who are some of the most vulnerable members of society. So I think we have a moral imperative as a society to respond to this social ill. You'll hear Lila talk about there's some really eye-opening statistics with some of the work that the city is doing in terms of the number of years of homelessness cumulatively that they've ended by helping folks who are chronically homeless get off the street. And I think it just goes to show that this is a problem that has a tremendous human cost, and we have a moral imperative to respond to it. Secondly, as I just mentioned, there's a really strong evidence base demonstrating that we have an effective response to chronic homelessness. Permanent supportive housing works, and there's strong evidence to back it up. Third, just as chronic homelessness is expensive to society in terms of public service utilization costs, providing folks with permanent supportive housing can generate cost offsets in terms of reductions of folks' utilization of public services, and in some cases, not always, net cost savings. So just kind of illustrate what this looks like, the cost impact of permanent supportive housing. This is a slide showing essentially annual reductions in public service costs following placement in permanent supportive housing for folks who are housed in New York City. And so you see big decreases, especially in, not surprisingly, shelter costs, but also jail, psychiatric hospitalization, healthcare costs, such that what we see is that these cost reductions more than fully offset the cost of the intervention itself to the tune of about $900 or so. And this is some data from some recent work that I did looking at a program called the Community Support Program for People Experiencing Chronic Homelessness. This is a program that's funded by Mass Health that pays for the supportive services for folks who are chronically homeless in permanent supportive housing. So what we did is looked at reductions in healthcare costs following folks' entrance into permanent supportive housing. And what we saw is big reductions in inpatient and outpatient medical costs, such that the annual cost offsets associated with placement in permanent supportive housing were almost $12,000, and this is just in healthcare costs alone. So, the cost argument is something that gets thrown out there a lot as the rationale for addressing chronic homelessness, but I think it's important to emphasize that this shouldn't be the only argument that we use. As I said, I think there's a moral imperative, and we don't require other things to save money in order for us to determine them worth doing. And so I think it's important to remember that there is evidence that in some cases this is something that can save money, but in other cases, it does have a positive net cost, but the cost reduction, the service cost reductions can offset at least some of that cost and lower the net cost. And so I think it's still a worthwhile investment and a good use of resources, even if it doesn't always generate cost savings, especially because it's, I don't think we would require of other things for it to generate cost savings for it to be determined worthwhile to do. All right, so the point I want to end at is that we need to understand addressing chronic homelessness just as a beginning, not as an end. So, as I mentioned, there's been a lot of emphasis at the policy level on addressing chronic homelessness through the expansion of permanent supportive housing, but the majority of the population experiencing homelessness is not folks who are chronically homeless. Just based on some back-of-the-envelope math, there's more than 1 million people who over the course of the year experience non-chronic, or what might be referred to as crisis homelessness. These are folks who are homeless only on a fairly short-term basis. And we see that we haven't had as much progress as that graph shows in reducing crisis homelessness as we have had in addressing chronic homelessness. So that's, and again, just to reemphasize this, the majority of folks are not homeless on a long-term basis. So I think that's the challenge moving forward for the homeless assistance system is working to try and address crisis homelessness, so moving beyond chronic homelessness and thinking more generally about how we address crisis homelessness, and developing alternatives to permanent supportive housing that are equally as effective and less resource intensive. And there's lots of, Lila will probably talk a lot about some of what the city is doing in this area around diversion and focusing on housing stabilization. But another thing that I think there's a lot of momentum behind is using the healthcare system as a platform to address housing instability and using healthcare dollars in a way that supports housing stability. Just as one example of something that is going on, some other work that I'm involved with at the Department of Veterans Affairs, one thing that happens to all veterans who access outpatient care at a VA facility, they're asked a 2-question screening instrument about their housing status, and veterans who report some type of housing problem are asked if they want to be referred to talk to a social worker about their housing problem about their housing issues, with the goal of linking folks with resources that are available through the VA specifically for veterans. The key thing there is that there are a lot of resources that the VA has at its disposal to assist veterans who are experiencing homelessness or who are at risk of homelessness, but there's a lot of interest beyond the VA in using the healthcare system as a platform for addressing housing stability. So I will stop there, and hopefully Lila can pick it up and tell us a little bit more about what the City of Boston is doing.
Hi everyone. So I'm feeling like a bad Jew tonight. But I'm going to make up for it on Yom Kippur, I promise. I forgot, and wait, over here, my friend told me it was Rosh Hashanah. I care about Rosh Hashanah. Okay, so, and now this is really embarrassing. I was trying to prevent you from seeing my notes that say, hi everyone, I'm Myra Bernstein. I swear I'm not going to just read off of this, but it helps me to know it's there. We'll go to the slideshow. You'll pretend you never saw that. Hi everyone. I'm Myra Bernstein. My title is Advisor to the Mayor for the Initiative to End Chronic Homelessness. That's also my job description. And I am symbolically part of the Mayor's office, but I'm embedded at the Department of Neighborhood Development. And you had folks here last week talking about affordable housing. So the Department of Neighborhood Development is the affordable housing engine for the city of Boston. And it makes sense for my position to be embedded there because housing is the platform upon which you end homelessness. I also want to recognize my colleague, Commissioner Giselle Sterling, just sitting in the audience. I was told just this afternoon that she was going to be here, but because we're going to be talking about veteran and chronic homelessness, Commissioner Sterling was willing to be here tonight to help answer questions about veterans when we get to the Q&A. And she's an amazing public servant and leader for veterans in our city, and she has been extremely committed to this goal of ending veteran homelessness as well. So a little bit of context. How many of you read about the crisis in our city when the bridge to Long Island was condemned October 20? Okay, so I don't need to tell you that much about what that was, but for those of you who didn't raise your hands, maybe you didn't live in Boston at that time, we have a bridge, we have an island in Boston called Long Island, a little confusing, and there's a bridge that goes to Long Island that was very rickety. I had been over that bridge, it doesn't exist anymore. It was scary, everybody knew it was scary, and it was in disrepair for a long time. I believe the state, that's the state's, I shouldn't say. I think it's not owned by the city, but anyway, it's, I won't do that again. So the mayor made a call. So, before the mayor made a call. So out on that island, there was one of the city-managed emergency shelters for single adults, along with other programs, detox and residential treatment programs for people experiencing addiction. So very vulnerable people took this bus every night out to the island and got their services or slept there in this emergency shelter. And one afternoon, the structural engineers said this bridge isn't safe, and the mayor made the decision to evacuate immediately, no warning. So that was an enormous crisis for our system, and even more so, an enormous crisis for the people already experiencing the crisis of homelessness, then were being displaced right then and there without any warning. So. As a result, the mayor decided to convene a task force not just about, well, how do we permanently relocate all those beds? Everybody, who was being sheltered got a bed that night in an emergency location, but there needed to be a permanent site. So the mayor decided to convene a task force of community leaders, stakeholders, to not just say, well, how are we going to get through this crisis and resite a shelter, but how are we going to do better than what we were doing before? How are we going to actually end homelessness, not just manage homelessness, manage the crisis of homelessness? So that task force formed at the end of 2014, met for a few months, and we brought in consultants. I'm going to say we a lot. And when I say we, sometimes I mean the city, sometimes I mean we, the hundreds of people who are working on this action plan, which includes government folks, but also tons of really dedicated people in nonprofits who do the work that government sometimes pays for or funds. So there's a lot of we when I talk about this, and we usually talk about that big royal we. So the task force came together and figured out a plan to reach these goals of ending veteran and chronic homelessness. And that plan was released in June of 2015, and then later branded Boston's Way Home, with this picture of a maze and a path blazing over the maze to a home. So that's really the concept of this plan, is it's a maze in our city, it's a maze to find housing, and we need to do better for people who are very, very vulnerable and experiencing homelessness. So, you probably know all of these at this point, but I'll just say them real quick because they're important to the rest of what I'm going to say. Chronic homelessness is long-term homelessness among people with disabilities, as Tom and Libby explained. It's really a very small subset of the homeless population, but it's a very vulnerable, important subset. We have a moral imperative. These are also folks that our systems of care have failed the longest. They've often been shut out, thrown out, or rejected, or uninvited to other systems of care, and so they end up chronically homeless because no one's helping them. And so focusing on chronic homelessness does make a lot of sense as a place to start. Permanent supportive housing, I describe as affordable housing plus long-term stabilization or tenancy support services that help people maintain that housing. The Housing First philosophy is really about no preconditions, low barriers, as few kind of requirements before someone gets into housing, gets that basic need met, and then you use that platform of stability to help people make choices about what they want to do to be able to maintain that housing, or changes they may or may not want to make in their lives. And then, this is all very simplified, but the solution to chronic homelessness is this housing first approach and the permanent supportive housing resource. In most cases, there are some people experiencing chronic homelessness where permanent supportive housing isn't necessarily the right intervention, but in broad brush, that tends to be the right intervention. And so what's the city's role in ending homelessness? Maybe this is obvious, but I thought it'd be worth saying. It's really resources and leadership. So we, the city, receive a good, large grant from the federal government. It sounds really large out of context. We're applying for it right now. We compete for it every year. And it funds housing specifically for people who are homeless. And more the federal government has said, this is limited, so target it to people who are chronically homeless. It's a $26 million a year grant. That sounds amazing. Those housing units are full. So it's a lot of money, but it's not new housing. It's housing that exists and people already live in, and there's a little bit of turnover every year. The city also, as you heard last week, or some of you heard last week, the city develops affordable housing, and Boston's somewhat unique in that it made a decision in the late 90s, I believe, that 10% of that affordable housing that's developed is set aside for homeless households. So some of the units are larger and for families, and some units are smaller and for single adults or single parents with a very small child. So we call that the set-asides, and that has developed a bit over 1,200 units of affordable housing. The grant I mentioned before has about 1,100 units of permanent supportive housing. And then last, Libby mentioned this, the Boston Housing Authority has a homeless priority, which means the majority of people being housed from our local public housing authority are literally homeless when they enter. And that is an incredibly valuable resource to our efforts. And most housing authorities in Massachusetts, most housing authorities across the country do not have a homeless priority. And then mayor's leadership. So I'm not just saying this because I'm mayor's advisor for the initiative to end chronic homelessness, but I see this very clearly across the country, that having mayors come forward, take the steps to say, yes, we're going to do this very hard, we're going to accomplish this very hard thing. It matters. It rallies players, it rallies resources, and it brings people to the table. So Mayor Walsh joined this national challenge that was put out by Michelle Obama, First Lady Michelle Obama, back in 2014. Mayors across the country joined the challenge to end veteran homelessness, and then we released this action plan in 2015 saying we're going to end both veteran homelessness and chronic homelessness. So, yes, so this is, I'm glad you laughed. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, but really this is the maze that's in that, in our logo. And it doesn't even tell you half the story, but really so you can tell what's going on here. The top of the maze are places that people are before they become homeless. The middle of the maze are this kind of crisis response, places that people stay in the city of Boston when they're homeless. This predates the Long Island shelter being closed. And then the bottom are different buckets of different types of housing. There's permanent supportive housing, there's public housing, there's affordable housing, and then there's market rate housing, just housing in, with private landlords. And navigating this maze is awful, let alone if you're navigating the maze while parenting, or navigating the maze while dealing with an untreated mental illness, or anything like that. So at best case scenario, a chaotic system like this, which by the way is how it looks in almost every city across the country, or how it used to look at least, at best case, it's first come, first served to get these housing resources. But actually, it's worse than that. It's that people with the kind of most resources, the most capacity, find a way to advocate for themselves or have an advocate that will help them get into housing. And people who have most complexity, most vulnerability, can't make it to getting into housing. And so the whole concept of our action plan is about taking all these programs in Boston, some of which are highlighted as best in the nation, and becoming a single response system, where it's not about getting lucky, walking in the right door that happens to meet, you know, the criteria, or, you know, you get the star case manager, but that there's a system that's prioritizing the most vulnerable folks, and making sure they get the housing, very limited housing that we have, that we're prioritizing resources for people who are most vulnerable first, and allocating resources to kind of the right match, and focus on kind of the goals and centering the people that we're trying to serve, rather than programs who are very well intentioned but often will think just under their roof and walls. So we're constantly saying we have to be building a system. This has to be a system. This is no longer about your program. And we're saying that to bureaucracies as well. This is no longer about your rules. This is about doing the work and reaching these goals. So the goals of the plan are clear, and we know